So this group, I don't know, I think they describe themselves as a group, but I think they all do kind of work quite closely together. Have been developing over the last year or so a very interesting, multifaceted and radical critique of the role that traditional cartography, official cartographies, have played in the way the pandemic is being represented, being explained, and the measures being taken by various governments legitimated and made sense or not of. And they've approached this task from a number of different directions, as you'll see. But we're delighted that they can all come together to give us this sort of very rounded and, I say, multifaceted reading of how the pandemic has been officially mapped, and then also looking at actually what alternative ways there are of mapping or counter mapping the issues that have arisen in the course of the pandemic. Okay. So we're going to start with a presentation by Andrea Parser, which he entitles Motion and Emotion in Viral Maps. Andrea is a professor of historical and social geography at the University of Padua. And I think a lot of his research has been about historical cartographies, how particularly states have used mapping to kind of construct a sense of territorial identity, or kind of give a kind of rationale to that, and how that has affected the setting of borders in Europe, as well as in colonial and post-colonial Africa. And he's carried out kind of field work in relation to that. So Andrea, can I hand over to you?
Yes.
To talk about motion and emotion in viral maps.
Now I share my screen, and so I can start my presentation. Yes. Okay, first, I would like to thank the organizer for this precious opportunity, and all of you for your participation. From the end of February 2020, in Italy, as before in China, and then in many other countries, we were suddenly hit by a storm, rather a whirlwind, which forced us into our homes, immobilized us in a terrifying silence. The cities blocked, the streets empty. The world stopped 200 meters from my house. We all found ourselves living a violent storm during the calm of a sultry summer day. We are trapped in an oxymoron. An oxymoron is a rhetorical device that uses an evident self-contradiction to reveal a paradox. The paradox we were immersed in was this immobile storm of the pandemic. As a geographer, I found myself experiencing a paradox, a situation of reversal. Locked in at home, I watched what was happening through the maps of the pandemic, which were spreading on the websites. Where maps were once used as a means for initiating movement, although of course not only, now the maps themselves embodied movement while I was forced into a state of immobility. The trauma is expressed by the slash, the red slash, by that fracture that reverses the game of roles. This was my way of living inside an oxymoron, in the middle of a still storm. So I began to observe what was happening on the maps to try in some way to react to this trauma. Maps like this one, well known, produced by Johns Hopkins University, the screenshot clarifies the situation on March 1st, 2020, have become, together with the count of the infected and the victims, an essential way to highlight a phenomenon that by its nature was invisible, carried by a tiny virus which changed everything without being seen. Arithmetic and geometry, a list and a map, two instruments used as a means for describing an event that would otherwise be difficult to comprehend. For example, during the scramble for Africa, between the late 19th and early 20th centuries, the European colonial officer found themselves faced with an unknown reality, difficult to interpret. To overcome the fear of the unknown, they began to draw maps and to list and enumerate population and resources, albeit in an often imprecise way, and in any case remaining functional to colonial purpose. Two movements took place within the maps of Italy in March of last year. The first was the gradual enlargement of the spots, the red spots that indicated the infected areas. And the second, the visualization of the progressive block of every activity, except the essential ones. Both of these movements were rapid, increasing, unexpected, and frightening. In these maps, color plays an essential role. Colors highlight not only the phenomenon on the pandemic maps, but also the intense emotion we experience through them. The emotional expression of color in mapping has already been well investigated in the literature, quoting Eckert, Robinson, or Tania Rossetto, as well as in reference to coronavirus, as in Phil Cohen. Red is the most frequent choice for characterizing infected sites. It is the color of danger, red alerts, and heat, fevers, funeral pyres. And its diffusion marks the virus progression on maps, often in form of spots spreading rapidly, almost like measles or smallpox pustules. With the deadly progression of the virus, the red obliterates all other features of a map, hiding a territory such that even territorial lines become invisible. See Lombardy in the map. Red is also the color of struggle because, as Hillman states, in battle, soldiers see red. Blue is often chosen to represent the progressive blocking of mobility during the pandemic. It is the color of cooling and freezing, of movements, of chilling, dark blue, ice blue, and the slowing down of social life. Comparing red and blue, Robinson noted that red often indicates something close, in this case, the proximity of danger, and blue something distant, in this case, the distancing of a social relationship. On the one hand, red also indicates a signal to stop, the impossibility of proceeding further. Prohibited areas are red. On the other hand, blue is also used to describe the atmosphere and the hydrosphere that are cleaned up thanks to the decrease in anthropic activities and the silence imposed on the mega machine of neoliberal capitalism. Blue skies even over the highly polluted Po Valley or in Punjab. blue waters, even in the Venetian lagoon or in polluted rivers all over the world. A recent volume edited by Kapor suggests that psychoanalysis could be useful in investigation of globalization. In the volume's title, within the word global, there is a capital O that symbolizes a hole, an emptiness, something unexplored, something dark. This hole at the center of the globalization represents an unconscious dimension. The heart of darkness made up of the features, exceptions, and contradictions that occur in the unconscious circulation of desires and fears, anxieties and dreams, traumas and emotional conflicts. In the traces of this dark hole, if the traces of this dark hole are normally visible only through small cracks and ripples in the spatio-temporal forms of globalization, the pandemic has instead opened a huge gap through which large masses of intrapsychic material escape, projecting them into a transindividual social scenario. On the viral maps, this eruption passes through their colors. The pandemic opened the passage that gave way to the emergence of deep, hidden, dark content, and it permitted color to pop up from what was once black. The crisis has pulled the color out of the black hole and projected it onto viral maps. The infinite density of the black hole of what comes from the depths is expressed in those colors that explode in the ignition of our visual awareness, quoting Tim Ingold. The opening of the black hole was also an occasion for a flowering of the unconscious world. Perhaps it would be healthier if a glimpse of that gap remained open, if a little color on the maps continued to talk about our emotion and inner drives. In recent months, a new color, green, has been added to the COVID-19 maps. As in this dashboard from the same site, Johns Hopkins University, green represents the progress of vaccine doses administered. Green is the color of hope, the color of the return of life. With the green at the traffic lights, you can leave. With the green pass, you can start traveling again. Although the funeral pyres are burning on the banks of the Indian and Nepalese rivers and in the incineration fields in the cities, the confidence of an imminent conclusion of the pandemic is now diffusing. But the green that is extending is not enough to cover the mourning and the loss that has occurred over these 2 years. So let me return for a moment to the trauma I have and we all have experienced to the big red slash. During the pandemic, I was restricted to my home in Este, a small city, 15 kilometers from Bo Euganeo, one of Italy's and the West's first so-called red zones. Exactly 200 meters from my house, the only distance allowed at that time, stands the Cathedral of Santa Tecla with its altarpiece by Giambattista Tiepolo, entitled Saint Tecla Intercede on behalf of the city of Este hit by the plague. The masterpiece of Tiepolo, one of the most important artists of the 18th century, dated 1759. The inhabitants of the small town of Este, offered this ex voto to thank the patron saint for ending the Great Plague of 1630, which decimated a third of the region's population within a few months, a third of the population. Until the pandemic, I had looked at the painting as a work of art, which spoke to me for the beauty of its setting, its colors, characters, and landscapes. Today, it has taken on a completely different meaning. It leads to a different, more human, more shared beauty. Now the altarpiece brings me to an empathy with the inhabitants of Este of the past centuries. I can better understand the meaning of that devastated land with bodies piled one on top of the other, and the dramatic image of a little girl searching for her lifeless mother's breast. In this work, the trauma of the 7th century plague was reworked through art. Horror generates its opposite, beauty. There is perhaps one lesson learned for us in this story. Indeed, too, it will take time to rework the trauma, the psychic significance of which we are only now beginning to sense. And the second, when we succeed, when we are on our way to a better understanding, it will perhaps be that the trauma of the pandemic has engendered new forms of expression of sensitivity towards others, capable of leading to a different and more interiorly lived beauty. Thank you so much for your attention. Now I give the floor to Laura Lopesti.
Just before you, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yeah. Yes. Oh, just before we hand over. Yes. Well, thank you very much, Andrea. And can I just say to everybody, if you have a comment or a question, please do type it in now. Don't leave it to the end, and I will be monitoring these comments and so on, and then in the discussion then Andrea will then return to that and address the issues you want to discuss. I think the issue he raises of the notion of a pandemic sublime of kind of beauty coming out of horror is a very powerful idea, and one which artists and also mappers need to perhaps think about. So already we have some food for thought, but now let's pass on to Laura. So Laura Lopesti is a visiting research fellow at the Groningen Research Institute for the Study of Culture, and her focus has been very much on cultural issues, as well as political phenomena such as migration, national identity, imperialism, and so on. And she's published work in 2 books. One is called Cartography I have to excuse my terrible pronunciation, Inososde. That's probably not how you pronounce it. But that was published in 2019. And then Mapping, Connectivity, and the Making of European Empires, which Roman and Littlefield published last year. So Laura, can you unmute yourself?
Yes, I'm here.
And over to you.
Yeah, let me share the screen. Okay, if all you can hear me, I can start. Just thank you, Phil, for this invitation. And I would say that in this plural effort to try to decipher and envision the cartographic imagery of the coronavirus spread, I was particularly interested in retracing, let's say, less sublime or less spectacular media maps and engage instead with other mapping impulses that were somehow underneath or perhaps unnoticed early in the outbreak. At the time, in fact, of exchanging notes with my colleagues, we also realized that many of the debates on COVID-19 and mapping began to uniquely verge on this possible use of GPS-enabled devices and mobile apps to track infected bodies. And following also pressing questions on how this kind of panoptic cartography could awaken modernist desires for control and surveillance. These tech-based approaches to coronavirus were in fact highly criticized also within the academy and discussed alongside notions of algorithmic governance, surveillance, capitalism, or authoritarianism. And this trend, of course, although highly captivating and eye-opening, but I would say more for what will happen after the end of the crisis, what we will do with all this health tech. On the other hand, began, I would say, to obscure and overlook other sides, other phases of the map. First, within this discourse of surveillance and contact tracing, what was not considered was also maps frictions and weakness, and the fact that many of these apps actually simply failed or were not used in many Western countries. And second, I would say that this idea of a new map opticon somehow dampened the possibility to focus on other mapping projects and that emerged as useful, inventive, optimistic tools actually in many other contexts. Maps, in fact, have also expressed, let's say, the viral contagion of an alternative and underestimated phenomenon, that of solidarity. And curiously, now that I return to these mapping projects of solidarity, which I will talk more about later, we really could think of them and look at them as kind of visual rediscoveries of the vibrant, also an easy and effective sense of what living in and for a community means. We all know the context in which this solidarity has taken root, because it has been also brilliantly described before by Andrea. So from one day to the next, many people were left immobilized, unable to physically carry out essential daily activities such as shopping, buying medicines, going to the doctor. But it was precisely for this that many citizens, neighborhoods, social movements, volunteer organizations responded to these unprecedented times by jointly and transversally coordinating through several platforms and social networks. So this was mostly a digital mobilizations that was rapid and spontaneous, and it provided basic services and psychological support, in contrast, let's say, with the slowness, the delay, the inability of many states and their nearly collapsed welfare systems to promptly react to the consequences of this physical distancing and the halt of activity forced by the lockdowns. So that we could say that really in the various lockdowns experience worldwide, the impossibility of these face-to-face encounters has made possible a new digital space and also the digital map to become a tangible window through which to access reality. We could say an entryway through which different volunteers can sustain themselves, can connect each other, and raise public awareness over the texture of social solidarity, both at the local, the national, and on the global scale. So many actually participatory mapping projects have mushroomed everywhere in the world, from United Kingdom to Spain to Italy, all the Latin America, as a form, I would say, of a transversal cartographic solidarity that was geared towards aiding vulnerable people. So in the remainder of this intervention, I want to briefly reflect on this idea, this concept of solidarity and its intersections with mapping, because solidarity has been, let's say, historically, philosophically, also from a juridical point of view, interpreted differently. As a moral value, an emotional bond, a practical service, a juridical right, or a duty. So it's no surprise that also the philosopher Ernesto Laclau referred to solidarity as a floating signifier, as a kind of open concept, and a concept that often recalls donations, but also the collective sharing of services, goods, ideas, and conflicts with notions of property and privatization. And on the other hand, also these experiences of solidarities are important because they reveal an uneven social system. So foreground the necessary interdependency of people in a community, reinforcing also their sense of social cohesion. And I would also go beyond, let's say, also easy idealizations of this concept of solidarity, because acts of solidarity may even bring an uncomfortable dimension both to the giver and the receiver, mostly for the receiver, which often remains underlying. So this is also the condition of unease experienced through encounters with outside, to the fact that we actually expose our vulnerability to strangers. And in fact, as also Schwert and Schwenken noticed in this article published in 2020 on the concept of solidarity and migration, they noticed actually that in such extemporaneous and, let's say, diagrammatic bonds between different bodies, heterogeneous bodies, solidarity practices do not seem to suspend differences nor level them out, but they serve as a starting point to relate differences to one another. And in situations of emergency, like the one sparked by the COVID-19, solidarity has been quickly and spontaneously constituted from below in the face of many governments' mismanagement of relief efforts. So let's say that this transversal solidarity has been mobilized first as a kind really of substitutive carrying body between the cities and the state, after, like in a second dimension, as a kind of intermediary, overcoming forms of national of exclusion on the national level. So like echoing the metaphor of Andrea, yes, we were all in the same terrible storm that is COVID-19, but we were not all in the same boats, let's say. So in this framework, the map really could be thought as a kind of compass to orientate in such storm, a multisensorial but also informative operational interface through which also in this case contingent forms of solidarity arise, constructing an intricate web of relationship in which the interests, I would say, of the mappers and the mapped could be aligned, although of course power asymmetries could certainly shape such relationship in very different ways. So in my case, I would say that living in Barcelona's quarantines in Spain, first with the impossibility to come back to Italy, then with the fear to come back to Italy, where the situation was much worse than in Spain, I had to embrace another country as my home and work for such community, respecting its rules also in order not to add harm. And my personal experience of sharing practices of solidarity was at first with these altruistic posters on buildings, stairwells and exterior walls, through which neighbors and activist groups offered their help. So despite the climate of suspicion and panic sparked by the media at the time, where people were told to fear one another, many others, I would say, genuinely decided to meet the new needs of those around them. So several groups started also to coordinate it through Twitter and Telegram, creating specific mutual support channels for their neighborhoods. And as the phenomenon became increasingly popular, for instance, there was the need to construct this solidarity map of Barcelona through Google My Maps that showed that the network actually was rigged up in 15 days and today includes more than 48 organizations. And as the time progressed, there were also other projects that emerged, like this one, Solivit, produced, let's say, by much more engaged academics, a platform initially created by the Autónoma University of Barcelona, and now counting more than 30 partners worldwide, where they proposed to create this map that could collect today, I would say, about more 2,000, let's say, solidarity initiatives in 28 countries. Or there was also this other project, Solidarity and Care during the COVID-19 pandemic, produced by the Sociological Review, that also integrated a map in its website to foster knowledge exchanges about caring strategies, solidaristic initiatives, but also problems, you know, crises that would have otherwise remained unseen. And alongside these projects that exploit, let's say, geovisualization maps to offer this spatial, this hypnotic overview of mutual aid organizations, other forms of mapping, also sometimes navigational, let's say mobile, have also emerged to directly and practically connect givers and people in need, like this project, Frena la Curva, which was conceived first as a forum through which volunteers could bring their ideas and support to vulnerable and isolated people, elderly, disabled, homeless, children, to cope with the COVID-19. And then it's only integrated this kind of map-centric, GPS-enabled peer-to-peer platform using Ushahidi, which is a well-known crowdsourced platforms for humanitarian initiatives that was initially developed to map reports of violence in Kenya after the 2008 election. And the platform provided both, let's say, utilitarian and aesthetic forms of engagement. In fact, of course, the GPS allowed users to locate areas where citizens were offering or needing help, or offer the possibility to create surveys with meaningful colors and images, and specific teams reviewed incoming requests according to their specific expertise. And they were also sensitive to the fact that many people in need actually could not own a smartphone or a personal computer, or they probably would not have a Wi-Fi signal. Or most of all, they could be also subject to more nuanced social pressure, such as the shame, of course, of exposing the vulnerability to strangers, which calls to the mind this unintentional unease that I referred at the beginning, the solidarity can cause. So to mitigate such discomfort, the figure also of an intermediator was introduced to the platform, the so-called need through proxy function that allows someone to act on behalf of the person in need, so that the person could stay away from the platform but still benefit from it. But in truth, then, following the statistics of this platform, there was perhaps too much solidarity and not an evident request for help that possibly passed also through other channels. Or we should also consider the fact that when posting your offer of help, you could just leave your number, your phone number, or your email, so to avoid these people to post their request on the map. But as the access, I would say, to all these platforms is becoming much sparser and slower, I would say that solidarity somehow revealed itself as a kind of temporary, intermittent, elusive phenomenon that unexpectedly appeared and vanished and then reappeared again, because with the curve flattening in many countries, digital maps were destined to wait and then ready to reanimate in the face of the various waves of the coronavirus. and perhaps to ultimately rest as visual relics, thus becoming a kind of archive, a trace of a collective endeavor that will not easily be forgotten. Because yes, the driving force of all these initiatives was the fact that it is an extraordinary time and people need to stick together, but really we should try to keep also this relationship going in other forms. So I think that in this sense, my concern, but also I believe the concern of my colleagues was that this technical ideological critique of the cartographies of the crisis were right, but they could also obscure the deluge of these other extemporaneous and cartographic experiences that have emerged out of an emotional need to connect with others within or beyond the borders of different kinds. So after, like, I will give the floor also to Tanya. I would end this intervention by quoting this text from Marina Citrin when she reflects on this idea of pandemic solidarity. And she said that, yes, we are afraid, yes, we feel pain and vulnerability. And what we do with that again and again throughout history, and now more than ever, is to reach out to one another and find ways to care for each other. So I believe that the map could become, let's say, a kind of a grid of intelligibility, a kind of way to reach out to one another and find ways also to care for each other. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Andrea, and to also to leave us with this principle of hope. You know, to understand that digital mapping platforms can actually increase the forms of solidarity and powers of social combination, especially in conditions where, you know, people are getting used to or normalizing social atomization and isolation and so forth. So it was very important, I think, to bring those examples forward, you know, where some new possibilities are emerging out of the pandemic. So thank you so much. And again, people will obviously, I'm sure, have comments and questions. So please do use the chat facility for doing that. So now we're moving on to the next presentation by Tanya Rosetto, who's an associate professor of cultural geography at the University of Padua, and her research it particularly focuses on the relationship between map studies and visual studies, and so she's interested in, well, various kinds of mappings, I suppose, the link between cartographic theory and literary studies, and she's, you know, published a lot around those issues. Her recent book is entitled Object-Oriented Cartography, Maps as Things, and as someone who's worked his way through Bruno Latour and a few other object-oriented things, I was extremely interested to you know, this book, I think, actually does break some new ground. So Tanya, can you, are you unmuted? Yes, you are. So over to you.
Yes, thank you. Let me share my presentation. Do you see it full screen? Yes, okay. So thank you again for having us. Well, as its status changed from epidemic to pandemic, COVID-19 incited debates about the rising sense of a shared human condition in a super global world. Indeed, global mappings of COVID-19 had the capacity to frame a global community of infection. Nonetheless, particularly when very few countries were pursuing health emergency and lockdown measures, the national frame played an essential role in the governance, communication, and perception of the pandemic. Far from uniting humanity in a global endeavor, the pandemic has actually reinforced the physical and symbolic boundaries between a country's citizens and foreigners. Of course, we should contextualize national governmental cartographies of infection and disease within radical, biopolitical, political ecological, and also geopolitical approaches. But in what follows, I would like to hint at an additional perspective that draws from everyday nationhood theories to appreciate unorthodox and strange national cartographic practices and objects related to the experience of COVID-19. Commentators have suggested that nationalism is a side effect of the coronavirus, that the nationalism associated with populist politics risks being exacerbated by the pandemic, and that the closure of borders pushed back globalization and reinforced the conflict and competition between states. Yet, as Ski and Jimenez Martinez early contended when commenting on the nexus between coronavirus and nationalism, I'm quoting, "The problem of these arguments is that they tend to view nationalism in very narrow and very negative terms. Instead, they suggest that, I'm quoting again, if we want to make sense of the continuing salience and power of the nation, particularly in times of crisis, we need a wider understanding of nationalism," end of quote. This attitude has grown out of the current research on everyday nationhood. This term marks a recently emerged scholarship that focuses on the contingent, grounded, multi-layered, everyday experiences of a nation. Indeed, while nations are still often marked by derogatory attributions in intellectual debates, more progressive conceptualizations have been increasingly acknowledged. As we will see, the approach to national pandemic cartography, here advanced, is based on an innovative theoretical stance that combines recent cartographic theories with everyday nationhood studies, an endeavor Laura and I have been carrying out in the last years with Livingmaps studies. As Marko Antončić has suggested, in a post-pandemic realm in which nationalism is expected to grow, we need to be even more attentive to all the ways in which nations are mobilized by different people in different situations and with different aims. And maps are involved in these mobilizations. Well, I started collecting visual and material renderings of Italy to grasp how the infected body of the nation was cartographically thematized during the early phase of the pandemic, when Italy was the second country in the world to be seriously affected by the virus. In so doing, I valued unexpected modes of experiences and understanding the national feelings and practices emerging from mundane interaction with maps. In truth, while lockdown measures were dramatically impacting my family life, I initially neglected coronavirus cartographies. Strangely, as a researcher focused on cultural cartographies, I was rejecting a prompt personal academic engagement with a topic that was causing me stress and suffering. However, little by little, I began receiving emails from colleagues, and Andrea first of all, linking disparate maps in strange cartographic experiments that dealt with the virus. My son then composed a comic with the virus as protagonist, including a childish reproduction of the Johns Hopkins University map. All this made me realize that cartography was rapidly becoming essential in building both private and collective imaginings of the pandemic. So I began following coronavirus maps online, particularly in relation to Italy. Significantly, on the 5th of March, while Italy was becoming a cautionary tale for many countries in Europe, CNN's airing of a map full of red arrows departing from Italy and arriving to several parts of the world triggered a heated controversy on social media and Italy's press. This image was felt as insulting. Yet, the internet was crowded with domestic visualizations of the cartographic shape of Italy, variously thematized in relation to the virus by an array of different actors. Those visuals involved the geobody of the nation by creatively adopting its cartographic form to convey information, communicate measures, share opinions, or express feelings. Then I began to concentrate on one of those pervasive cartographic imaginings, the so-called female doctor Lalling Italy, authored by Franco Rivoli. The map of the nation is here incorporating what could be termed an iconography of the health worker, and in particular of the nurse figure, emerging within COVID-19 visual cultures. As an infected patient left without the possibility of having contact with parents and friends, wrapped in a national flag, Italy is embraced by a female doctor with the wings of an angel. Italy's geobody is here cared for. As frequently happens in popular patriotic cartographies, the nation here enters a process of somaticism that transforms the nation's territory into an object of visual piety, encouraging the beholder to engage the nation's territory corporally and effectively. On the 10th of March 2020, the day after the red zone was extended to the entire country, the image was posted on Facebook by the local section of the Associazione Nazionale Carabinieri of Chiaravalle Centrale. Soon shared by thousands of people, it was popularized by Italian mass media and by being displayed in giant format on one of the towers of the Papa Giovanni XXIII Hospital in Bergamo as a gesture of gratitude to all the medical staff engaged in the health crisis of one of the most tragically affected cities. Now, this popular cartographic image could be legitimately subject to critical readings as a quintessential biopolitical representation, a reactionary nationalist icon, or the questionable product of a masculine gaze on the supposed specific female function of Lalling, as in the case of the much criticized and immediately modified iconography of the contact tracing app Immuni, released in Italy in early June. However, I would like to open up an additional layer of interpretation. This image migrated across sites, media, bodies, and screens, tracing the mobilities of this map across the internet, revealed how traveling cartographic visuals can be shared to involve different audiences, post-processed to be appropriated, re-edited to form affective communities, and moved from digital to analog formats to create tangible, visceral aesthetics. The female doctor Lalling the map of Italy migrated through both conservative and progressive communicative contexts and was remade by people of different ages, class, and backgrounds to locally express multiple feelings related to a shared condition on a national scale, encompassing not just hot or banal forms of nationalism, but also everyday enactments of a common sense of the nation through multiple affective materialization. Transferred and embodied as an object, this map entered the realm of a democracy of cartographic things that requires a reconsideration of reductive and essentializing readings of national cartography. Fogu, Homa, and Roberto suggested that the many acts and cultural responses emerged during the lockdown in Italy such as, I'm quoting, breaching confines orally by singing and holding concerts from balconies across courtyards, evoked a sense of the nation in the name of earth and goodwill, a far cry from the reactionary politics that the flag more often symbolizes. Polic and Migliano accurately reconstructed the chronology of us through which mainstream Italian identity discourses developed from late January to April 2020. As they well described in nuanced passages, we passed from the Italy of barconi, namely boats carrying migrants, that is a national identity defined in relation to immigration, to the Italy of balconi, namely balconies, that is a national identity defined by the sense of common suffering. Taking notice of pandemic unexpected national mappings as part and parcel of the everyday materialization of common national senses could help with focusing more deeply on the complex issue of everyday nationhood in times of crisis. What does a map tell us about the ways in which nations emerge in everyday experience? Can cartographic practices tell us about the negotiations, encounters, tensions, and feelings of a nation? In a time of spatial media, navigational tools, and digital cartography, the fixed map of a nation may be seen to be an outdated device with little meaning beyond school-time memories. Instead, and to conclude, maps concerning national themes continue to be virally disseminated through media and political circuits, institutional venues, advertisement and communication materials, creative and participatory processes, among others, where we live in an era of ego-centered mapping, with people mainly accessing maps on the move through streamlined navigation on digital devices. We should consider that subjects also navigate daily through those same devices, a digital cartosphere populated by infographics, dashboards, spatial renderings, and geovisuals that incorporate national framings. The recent large-scale online mobilization of disparate cartographies of nations infected geobodies during the coronavirus pandemic constitutes a vivid case in point. Thank you.
Let's do this. Thank you so much, Tanya. A really thought-provoking presentation there. Sort of brought to mind Antonio Gramsci's notion of the popular national and its tensions and contradictions, but within a cartographic frame. Very interesting connections there. Right, so now we come to our final presentation this evening from Giada Patel, with whom I'm saying Livingmaps Network. We've been working with Giada on one of our projects, the Young Citizens Atlas. So we've got to know her through that collaboration. And she's a lecturer in literary geography at the University of Padua, or Padova, I should say. And she works in this field of geohumanities, exploring the links between geography, literature, and comics. Is how we came across her work. Actually, something very interesting she'd written about graphics and comic books. She has this book, Comics as a Research Practice, Drawing Narrative Geographies Beyond the Frame, which came out from Routledge in 2021. So, Giada, are you there? Can you unmute?
Yes.
And we're looking forward to your presentation.
Thank you so much, Phil, and thank you all for inviting and having us. It's a pleasure to present my work together with all my colleagues from the University of Padova in this international context, and also telling our own very also local stories in a broader international audience. So it's really interesting. Thank you so much. Can you see the slides changing? Because I know it's always a question when we start. Is it all right? Yes? Good. So my presentation starts from the general consideration that throughout history, the viral maps of epidemics have largely focused on the physical geography of their spread rather than their emotional impact. The maps about which I'm going to speak, though, start from the apparent difficulty to represent or map what Phil Cohen called the unthought known, namely the deeper, more unconscious responses to the pandemic. I will do this starting from the perspective of a cultural geographer working in the field of the humanities. So as my research focuses on the exchanges between cartography and art, between graphic artists and geographical representations, I'll consider artists' cartographic reactions to the COVID-19 as implicit creative maps. As Beau et al. Observe, in response to the, and I quote, to the ubiquitous graphs and maps of the COVID-19, artists, but also designers, data scientists, and public health officials have been teaming up to create counterplots and subaltern maps of the pandemic, end quote, aimed at representing both its social and intimate impacts. These visualizations function as counter maps and provide readers with a critical orientation to interpret data, navigate the new material landscapes of the pandemic, and also explore its impact at different global and local scales. This spatial visualization mostly focused on emotional, affective, intimate, and sometimes even hidden aspects of the unexpected geographies drawn by the pandemic. To be honest, at first glance, not many of these graphic representations that I will speak about coincide with traditional intended cartographic products. Yet, with Winter, I firmly believe that a map is not a natural kind of representation, having neither a fixed graphic and material form, nor a stable definition and use, of course. In fact, the map is a contingent and unstable representation that emerges from multiple practices, as we have seen in the previous presentations by Andrea, Tania, and Lara, of course. A graphic representation that we would not typically interpret as a map can also be applied cartographically when it carries out the double function of representing pandemic space and orientating us in unstable COVID-19 spatialities. Thus, I would like to expand our talk about pandemic cartographies, including creative graphic representations. So if we understand maps as graphic representations that facilitate a spatial understanding of things, concepts, conditions, processes, or even events in the human world, then it will be easier to think of the following examples as creative maps that contribute to the understanding of many spatial conditions connected to the COVID-19. As Cartwright and Heath observe, even an apparently innocent choice, such as the one between the use of a hard or a soft pencil, can generate very different portrayals of the same real world and spaces. While more traditional cartographic projections of the worldwide spread of COVID-19 used a so-called hard pencil to precisely account for the data of the contagion in different geographical areas, many artists instead used a soft pencil to react to the call for an alternative visualization of the impact of the pandemic, allowing for more impressionistic visions. For example, the postcards from a pandemic collected by the New Yorker propose a creative cartography of the effects of the pandemic on disparate landscapes, mainly urban, all around the world. These postcards map the views of many international artists, including Bianca Bagnarelli, Jishu Choi, George Colombo, Adrian Tomine, and German designer Christoph Niemann, whose portrait of a lonely musician playing on bagpipes in front of a usually bustling Brandenburger Tor is displayed in this slide. So virtually sent from Belgrade, Berlin, Guangzhou, London, Madrid, New York, Paris, Seoul, and Tel Aviv, among others, these postcards were circulated as pieces of a shared cartographic mosaic that asks to be read as a whole. Thanks to their explicit location, these drawings represent points on an implicit map, not visible yet present, a map whose meaning is relational and in a constant state of emergence. As Bianca Bagnarelli writes, commenting on her postcard, I quote, "Without any people around, every place looks the same, united by the feeling that something sinister lies in a completely deserted space." Even if she is walking in Bologna, her words resonate with the urban portraits of many other artists and with urbanscapes that many of us have experienced during the pandemic and the lockdown. What emerges is a multi-scalar visualization of pandemic spaces. The postcards shown in the slide, for example, portray the worldwide compression of everyday mobilities and show how, during the pandemic, our everyday maps have been reduced to the enclosed space of the neighborhood, the block, the apartment, the house, the flat, the room, or even a single window frame. Many artistic graphic projects were meant to help readers in mapping and making sense of their own everyday landscapes through sharing common anxieties, hopes, and troubles. In Italy, as soon as the pandemic unexpectedly arrived at the end of February, the graphic voices of Italian artists rapidly became useful tools for people in other countries to start mapping how their interior, but also exterior landscapes will be affected by COVID-19. One example is Emiliano Ponzi's project for the Washington Post, titled "From a Restricted Italy, an Artist's Eye on the Coronavirus," which is now collected in the published volume Chronicles from the Red Zone. His illustrated chronicles started on March 14, 2020. Even if stuck in Milan, Ponzi decided to move his chronicles across disparate locations through interviewing friends living in other countries. Oh, sorry. Each illustration is accompanied by a text documenting the date and location, a vignette about personal life during the quarantine, often with short everyday life dialogues, and the data and number of infected and virus-related deaths in Italy on that date. Ponzi's illustration functions as a soft pencil that humanizes the data through a personal graphic perspective. Their juxtaposition with numeric data shows how using a single number to represent a geography such as a city, a state, a country, obfuscates variability within that area, end quote, from Bowie et al. Ponzi's project is only one of the many emerged since the beginning of the pandemic. Another project that is worth mentioning and exploring here is Ale Giorgini's Intervallo window edition. Georgini worked with drawings realized on pictures sent by his followers on Instagram from all over the world. His playful drawings challenge the fixity of our view on the world from the window, of course, imagining the frame of our window as an opportunity rather than a limitation. Again, each window represents a squared tale of a broader cartographic mosaic. Another project called The Voyage of Italy, realized by the artist activist Gianluca Constantini, is namely one of the most important graphic journalists in Italy, moves in a similar direction. Stuck at home, Costantini played with the idea of the traditional grand tour of the 19th century, imagining a far more dramatic travel across Italy's pandemic chronotopes. His Voyage presents a collection of drawings inspired by amateur photographs, mostly taken by nurses and doctors during the health emergency. To facilitate their worldwide circulation, the illustrations include only short captions to indicate the location: Parma, Ravenna, Milano, Bergamo, Piacenza, Venezia, Roma, among others. And Costantini's counter map of Italy represents hospitals and field hospitals, nurses, army trucks transporting corpses from one city to another that became part of our daily pandemic imaginaries. Furthermore, the graphic journalist focuses also on the symbols of newly appeared borders on our daily maps and restrictions that limited our daily mobilities during the pandemic. For example, the illustration in this slide shows a military checkpoint in the streets of Voioganeo that was mentioned by Andrea before my presentation. So these evocative illustrations visualize the new material landscapes of the pandemic, and put together, their assemblage leads to the composition of an emotional cartography that evokes readers' affective engagement. Like in Ponzi's one, also on this Voyage, maps are absent but implicit. In fact, once again, the reference to a precise spatio-temporal context suggests a cartographic use of this illustration, which permits readers to locate and put them in relation, as I've tried to do in this map that you see here on this slide. According to Bowie et al., artists' visualization, quote, prompt their publics to critically assess the making of COVID-19 visualizations and to plot curves and charts and maps of their own, end quote. Artists' creative maps, thus, can function as triggers for vernacular and creative mappings to be realized by a wider audience. According to this idea, in April 2020, Bloomberg City Lab invited its readers to create a map to reflect how forces of change had remapped our lives collectively and privately, literally and metaphorically, since COVID-19 had begun. The collective counter mapping project was titled How 2020 Remapped Our World, and collects more than 400 homemade maps that are straightforward or subjective, realized through assemblages of drawings, subway maps and urban plans, photographs, illustrations and comics, and even objects and pixels. So these very personal maps represent domestic rearrangements, psychic landscapes, redefined boundaries, virtual connections, and natural callings, and reflect the ways in which people around the globe have experienced this crisis in very different ways. For example, Patty Haida, living in St. Louis, Missouri, limited the scale of her map to her bedroom, showing her limited mobility. So commenting the map that you see on this slide, she observes, I mapped my bedroom where the spaces and views of pandemic life, family, and work collide. My map charts the spaces now collapsed into one: my private personal space, my ad hoc office workspace, and the Zoom stage, of course. This is an everyday map we are all very familiar with, of course. Also, Ashwin Tahilani focused on the redefinition of his daily mobilities. Before the pandemic, he affirms, commenting on the map displayed in the slide, I will use all possible modes of transport and visit many nooks and crannies of the city on a daily basis. I began to feel that this entire city was my own neighborhood. So when the pandemic and subsequent lockdown hit India, it brought all of my wandering to a complete standstill. Now, I only walk in the area around my home. Despite the forced immobility and distance of many bodies, the circulation of these creative maps showed a potential space where virtual mobilities and interpersonal connections could be reinforced during the pandemic. Through the recognition of common everyday mobilities and immobilities, of course, and chronotypes of the pandemic, a trans-scalar collective process of map making was activated by these creative graphic mosaics. So, to conclude, facing the limits of conventional cartographic projections during crisis, we often turn to creative spatial representations. As I have tried to demonstrate through these few examples, seeing with artists' imaginary maps, we find cognitive tools that can help us navigate the real world. The creative map makings I have mentioned in this section offer a counter mapping of the many database cartographies that were diffused by and went viral through the media since COVID-19 started to spread globally. Their imaginative force has the power to disrupt cartographic projections based on the physical geography of the virus spread by mapping subject matter that does not traditionally appear in pandemic maps, such as emotions and intimate spatial spheres. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Giada. Well, again, a very rich presentation with some really amazing graphics. I'm glad to see postcards re-emerging as a medium. Of course, actually, artists have continued to use postcards. Actually, although they've fallen out of. I mean, they used to be used as an everyday form of communication before people had telephones. Even they used to write postcards and send messages and so on. So anyway, I'm glad to see that they've been revived, and also that that one of the paradoxes that's come out not only of your presentation but of others is this notion of a sort of the sort of paradoxes of pandemic space, sort of forms of self-enclosure which create a new form of commons. It's a new formation. We have to think where that might go in a post-pandemic world. Well, so we've had these four very, very interesting and complex presentations, and I've asked Mike Duggan, who's to kind of comment, to look at the presentations. I think he has been in dialogue with one or two of the presenters in another context. It's quite a daunting task. I think he's very brave to undertake it, but to begin to respond to these presentations and allow our audience to sort of get their breath and to think of their own questions and comments. So again, just to stress, please do use the chat facility to say what it is you want to say. So Mike, are you there?
Yes, thanks, Phil. Hello, everyone, and thank you so much for those presentations. I think it is a daunting task. I'm kind of sweating here, trying to figure out what I'm going to say. So I'm going to go to my notes. I'm going to go through each presentation one by one, and then try and bring some common themes together. So just bear with me for a few minutes. Okay, so let's start with Andrea's. I think what Andrea's presentation was really good at was thinking about this link between emotions and maps. And there seems to be sometimes a contradiction between emotions and maps. So emotions are these things which are kind of fluid and emerging, whereas maps are these things which are static and they don't represent the kind of emergence very well. And I thought what Andrea did, and I think also what the other presenters did, was kind of open the box on how cartography can deal with emotions as something which can be representable in some way or another. There's been quite a lot of work in geography in particular, which has looked at how do you represent emotions? Can emotions or effects be representable at all? And I think all of these works speak to some of the ways in which those things can, maps can work there as devices of representation. Also interesting about Andrea's presentation was this kind of relationship between pandemic maps and dashboards. And we've seen this, all over the news. Whenever there's a pandemic map, it's often associated with some sort of dashboard. So the dashboards are those things which are representing the data often alongside the map. And so I think when we think about pandemic maps, particularly the ways in which the narrative of the pandemic is being told through the media and through science, is also to think about these dashboards and the work that they're doing in kind of conveying a certain narrative about where the virus is and how it's affecting countries around the world. I also want to speak a little bit about colours. So Andrea really eloquently linked colours to maps and colours to the virus, and how certain colours are attracting or evoke certain reactions from maps. And I think the question I had for Andrea was are these colours that are used to represent the coronavirus, are they kind of culturally determined? So often we think that the traffic light system, red being a warning and green being good, is something which has come directly from nature. But I always wonder whether that's actually the case, and whether these are whether there's kind of Anglo-European ways which we can understand colours and how that might apply to cartographies. My other question for Andrea was around, I'll put these in the chat afterwards, was around how we might use cartography to represent the emergence from the pandemic. So that this kind of period we're in now, particularly in Europe, where we're starting to, but obviously not there yet, come out of the pandemic. It seems to me that pandemic cartographies are very much a kind of binary form of cartography. They're about before the pandemic or during the pandemic. There's not really much that I'm seeing in terms of cartographies about emerging from it, or perhaps kind of future iterations of pandemic cartography. Okay, so that was Andrea's, and again, thanks so much for a rich presentation there. Laura's, I really like the way that Laura treated maps as a kind of entry point rather than an end point. So maps are not a representation of the final world, or the ways in which the world exists. They're actually a way to think about possibilities within the worlds. And I like that kind of phrasing that you use around an entry point. Maps are things which produce spaces in known places, which is the other thing that kind of came to mind as I was listening to you. They're producing these new relations, particularly in local communities, of solidarity, and not necessarily control, as maps are often associated with. Yes, so I think my questions for Laura around how or have pandemic maps reshaped or redrawn lasting local communities, or is this just something which maps are being useful at the moment, and whether we imagine pandemic cartographies to have a kind of lasting significance on the new relations that they've produced in local communities. And I guess alongside that, how might pandemic maps be used in local or national policymaking in the future, particularly as we come out of the pandemic? They are a record of now, but they also have a potential to shape the future. Another phrase that I really liked from Laura was this idea that maps are kind of reanimating. So they are bringing community back to life, or ushering in old infrastructures or old social infrastructures back into being. And that's an interesting kind of turn of phrase. Maybe it's speaking back to, what have we lost in communities, particularly in urban areas, and how might maps help us reanimate? This is not necessarily going back to, it's perhaps, looking at what was working that we've forgotten or not doing anymore, and trying to make new of it. So yeah, thanks, Laura. I thought it was brilliant. Okay, then moving on to Tanya. So yeah, I really like the way that Tanya reframes our understanding of the nation through cartography. So often, well, what I heard and what I'm seeing is that the claims challenge our ideas about what national cartography is for. So it's not just for representing where the borders of a state are, or representing some form of subjugation or control over the people within or without or outside of those borders. It's actually asking us to rethink how we position ourselves in relation to the nation through cartography. So this kind of reattunement that she talked about towards thinking about national cartographies or nationalism as outward reaching, caring and supportive, rather than insular, inward looking, and not caring about our relations to the rest of the world. And in the paper that Tanya talked about, they expand on this far further in relation to migration. I recommend you read that. I was also thinking about national cartographies and particularly the ways in which the cartographies used in the media to portray the virus are very much drawn on kind of political cartography grounds. And there's an interesting tension here between the ways in which the virus has very little regard for borders, as we know, and the ways in which nations' policies towards the virus are kind of unfolding. So, there was individual lockdowns in each country, and that is a very different way that compared to how the virus is actually operating. I think cartography is an interesting medium to explore this idea of bounded nations and sovereign nations compared to the unboundedness of the virus itself. So I think my questions for Tanya are, what does the national map tell us about the ways that the nation is handling the pandemic? And then on the other side, what does it tell us about the differences in how different nations and cultures are handling the pandemic? So yeah, thank you so much, Tanya. And finally, onto Giada's presentation, where she really quite, articulately combines cartography and art, or moves us towards a kind of geo-humanities perspective of cartography. And I think what I saw in your presentation, Giada, was this idea that we're not really talking about cartography in the sense of cartography that emerged in the kind of 17th century Europe. We're actually talking more about different kinds of mapping here, so different ways in which we might represent the spatialities of the world and our experiences of them. And I think out of all the presentations, perhaps though the artworks which you talked about were really great at evoking how we can see or feel emotions through representation. And yeah, I really appreciated the kind of range of artworks which you presented. So yeah, I think the works help us think outside the grid lines of spatial representation as they're usually found. The other two things are around scales. So the multiple artworks which you represented are really useful for showing us the multiple scales of the pandemic, and it reshaped how we understand or how we act towards scales. Often these images are evocative of the many more scales that exist in everyday life than perhaps we thought did before the pandemic. So no longer is the house just the house. Now it's a section of rooms, a section of zones, a section of desks, a section of whatever. And I think the artworks are tied very well to the different experiences of the pandemic there. And then finally, the ways in which these scales interact with temporal dimensions. So, some of those artworks are really, really useful at showing us that, okay, we have multiple scales in the pandemic. These have been brought out by things like lockdown, but also these different scales are tied to different temporal dimensions. So again, if we go back to how different mappings are representing emotions, I think those mappings which represent that interaction between scale and temporality are really, really useful in kind of showing us what maps can do in evoking emotions. Yeah, so I think that's all I want to say about your presentation, Giada. Thanks so much. Two kind of general questions I had were around, I guess around the role of the state and commercial map makers in all of this. So why do different states and commercial organizations, why they're attempting to map the pandemic, and what are the reasons for that? I'm thinking particularly around, there's a Johns Hopkins kind of university science-led mapping on the one side, and then there's a kind of commercial Google mapping, particularly around movement data on the other, and how we're seeing, I listened to Dominic come and speak for hours today, and it's interesting how he talks about those relationships between the large tech companies and government, And we know that Google, for example, produced much movement data, which was shared with governments around the world. And a lot of that movement data was represented on their cartographies. And the final question was around maps and possible futures. And I think you all kind of evoked this in your presentations, that maps are not just a way to show something, but they're a way to, or an invitation to think about the future. And how might we look at cartographies as a way to imagine possible futures after the pandemic? So that is me, and I'll hand it over to questions now.
Right. Well, thanks very much, Mike, for I'm going to say panoptic, but anyway, a way, you've actually covered a lot of ground there, and obviously you've raised a number of very specific questions. So can I then ask our presenters, perhaps in the order of your presentation and Mike's response, to sort of come back and kind of respond to the issues and the questions that he's raised. So Andrea first.
Yes, thank you so much, Mike. Yes, you are right. We have a problem with colors. Like other elements of cartographic symbology, they are socially constructed in a specific context, and then they are socially declined. So white can be the color of marriage or mourning, celebration or grief. There is therefore a limit in my interpretation, which is in some way, speaking of me and of Italy, is Eurocentric, sorry. I think it would be necessary to go further and to decolonize our use of color or interpretation of color. It isn't an easy task. I think that it's necessary to use the methodologies of anthropologists and also historians and so on. Another interesting thing, and it's about colors. Another interesting thing is your question, your problem about the use of the dashboards and the relation with maps. So I think that the dashboard is something new also in this massive impact in our life. The dashboard, in my opinion, implies the continuous counting and updating of the data. But what the information actually says, what this data actually say, I think it should be certainly criticized. The risk is the taken for granted, and so it's very dangerous. These objective data that are not so objective and not so real as they want to demonstrate. I think there are the two main questions that you have posed. Thank you.
Thank you, Andrea. Laura.
Yeah, I'm here. So you made so many questions that, of course, then I forgot that. But yes, let's say that what really struck me was your idea to think about the potentiality of maps of solidarity, also in the context of how to bring local community then closer also to the state, stuff like that. And I would say that before to look at the future, we should also understand where they come from, because I would say that many of these mapping projects concerning solidarity or solidaristic initiatives were coming from two different areas, let's say. Some responded really to specific conditions arising from the lockdown, the confinement, but others were also prompted out by already existing solidarity networks that actually were active since the economic crisis of 2008 and so on. So there was something that was unstructured, and that was very interesting, because for the first time since many years, there were also ordinary, let's say, people that were embraced in this new sense and fitting to help each other, let's say common people. And so for the future, I would say that perhaps one of the actors that could really play a role in this is the city, are the municipalities. They could really benefit, I would say, from these solidaristic initiatives and acts as a kind of mediator between the local community and the state. And in fact, if I look at the city of Barcelona, like the municipality of Barcelona was one of the first who really took all these projects that were made by these activists and made them their own, let's say, and then it acts as a kind of intermediary between the citizen and the state, offering help in any way it could. And I was also thinking about this sentence that Richard Sennett wrote in one of his articles early in the pandemic, where he was saying that actually a welfare system needs a welfare state, but the contrary is also true. So the fact that we could really build this idea of welfare from below in order to let the state, you know, have a kind of a model that could imitate.
Okay, thank you very much. Right, Tanya.
Yes, thank you again for these comments. I believe that the explosion of national pandemic cartographies tell us that we should pay more attention to the complexities of national cartographies, but the same works for regional cartography, which is another often neglected form of thematic mappings. So as mentioned in the chat, indeed, pandemic national mappings have often also displayed difference between regions. Now, for instance, in Italy, we have red, orange, yellow, and white zones. And this works also for the different situations of the vaccination. So the nation, but also the division within the nation. I must confess that my perspective has been very Italo-centric, so I would like to see other works made within other contexts. I believe that iconographic traditions do play and national iconographic tradition do play a great role in COVID-19 visual cultures. So maybe and maps are part of those visual cultures. So maybe we could also think of comparative works about these national cartographic visualities and to see how this happened in different geographical contexts. Thank you.
Thank you, Tanya. Tanya, I think, was partly responding to a comment by Jane Muncaster. I'll just read it out so you get the full thing. COVID has led to a heightened sense of a north-south divide in England, and also the borders between the nations of the UK, that is Wales, Scotland, and Ireland. And the presentations make it clear that we should exploit radical mapping here to explore the complexities driving that sense of division rather than seeing them as inevitable. And I think that's right. I think that's a question that at Livingmaps we will need to return to, both in the journal and maybe also in some more practical work that we do. So so Jane, thanks for that. And now, so Giada, right, over to you.
Thanks. So I will try to come back to the main questions that Mike posed. And the first one is, of course, also a challenging one, which suggests how I was trying to rethink in a broader sense about what could play the role of a cartographic representation during the pandemic. And especially, I think that my movement was the other way around. So I came from this graphic representation and these artistic reactions to the pandemic condition. And I observed them from a spatial-centered and space-centered perspective. And I started to see how they related in a different way to the space and time location, and also to the data that were displayed at the same time in different maps and more traditional cartographic and viral maps representations in the beginning of the pandemic. And so this was my starting point, probably from a cultural cartography perspective, from a geohumanities perspective, as you said, and especially thinking about what is implicit and connected to the map in what in the representations, in the graphic representation that I mentioned, but also what kind of mapping practices these implicit maps were activating somehow. Because of course, yeah, I tried to do it in a very simple way, kind of remapping through OpenStreetMap the locations of the different illustrations made by Gianluca Costantini, for example. But what happened in my mind when I was seeing those illustrations being published day after day was starting to map them and to connect those visualizations to the different data that were displayed and shared at that time. And so of course, they are more connected to mapping practices and what came after these creative examples, and how vernacular mappings, such the one promoted by CityLab, were stimulated, of course, by these creative kind of mapping and spatial representations shared by artists. So I interpreted them as triggers for our own drawings and mappings and creative mappings. And as for the second question that is connected also to the third and final one, about multiple scales, yes, of course. So as you said, there are different scales that are represented both in the artist's graphic representations and implicit maps that I mentioned. There is, of course, the state, but also the city, but then there is, of course, the room and the frame of the single window from which many of us were staring at the outside world during the pandemic. And all of these different scales kind of collapse in these different representations. And it was interesting to me to see how at different scales, so looking at these representations on a global perspective, there were, of course, common features, but also many differences. And so I was trying to see what came out from these kind of implicit maps in terms of shared features, shared specialities, but also differences in this. And this comes to the final question which was connected to the perception of scale, space, temporality, and emotion, of course, which is a very hard question. And I think that was one of the final maps that I showed, the one where one of the readers of CityLab reacted to his changed mobilities, so representing his pandemic immobility in comparison to his previous mobilities. And I think that also in this case, the map was able to represent also on a graphic perspective the emotions that he then shared through his comment when he said, at the beginning, I was starting to feel, so before the pandemic, I was starting to feel as if the whole city was my own neighborhood, so something where I felt home. And then the space of my circulation was limited to the area around my house. And of course, this brought a different scale, a compression of temporality, a suspension of time of the daily rhythms, and the emotional effects that this brings with.
Okay. Right, we get one or two kind of questions. We've got about, well, another maybe 10, 15 minutes. Now, we've got one interesting comment, which actually came to my mind at the same time, was by Shirley Chubb. I think relates to Giada's presentation about the influence, conscious or unconscious, of de Chirico's work, because of course this the images you show of these kind of deserted spaces, the colonnades and so on, seem to be sort of whether it's an explicit reference back or whether it's just there in the ether, as it were. So there's an issue there about the kind of the aesthetics of mapping and counter mapping, and I suppose also how artist maps, and of course there's been this whole kind of whole generation of artists that have kind of moved into using maps in various ways as part of their arts practice. But how all that relates to a kind of popular aesthetics of mapping, and well, the maps, for example, some of the work we do, children's using drawing and photography and collage and so on, but not, of course, influenced largely by by these formal aesthetic experiments. So, what's the relationship between sort of the maps that people make spontaneously or as part of participatory mapping projects? What are the aesthetics of those, and how they relate to some of the kind of artists' maps that we've been looked at? So that was one thing I wanted to raise, and the other one was the idea of an archive. I mean, obviously, the memory politics of the pandemic are emerging, I suppose. I mean, in this country, there is a wall which basically features everybody who's died as a result of COVID, and I expect different countries have also different kinds of cultures of collective memory. So it may be that will emerge in different forms, but clearly cartography can and perhaps should play a role in that, but also the maps that are being produced. I mean the Bloomberg example, it's very self-consciously an archive, and a curated archive at that. But then what about just ordinary folk who are not artists and not cartographers? So far as they're involved, we work with some children who are making maps about how their everyday lives have been affected by lockdown and so on. So they're not going to be collected, or it's perhaps more difficult to collect them. But so anyway, so a general thing: what role should cartography play in the memory politics of COVID, of the pandemic? So anybody feel free to pitch in.
So I can rapidly jump into the comment on Bianca Bagnarelli's work. Unfortunately, I'm not Bianca Bagnarelli, who is one of the most marvelous and beautiful graphic artists from Italy and very internationally world known. But of course, as also emerged from Andrea's presentation and also from Tanya's and Laura as well, all these cartographic representations are culturally based somehow. So the location is not only explicit in the definition of where the drawing was set, but is also emerging implicitly from the cultural references that emerge from these drawings. And when I say cultural references, we can see the Chirico in this case, but also what represents a landmark of that specific space. So for example, these are the portici, so a specific architecture from Bologna that we are all used to see in a bustling way with many students moving all around. So seeing it in this surreal representation that really recalls the Chirico's imaginings is a very powerful way to represent how the streets of the city, of different cities, became empty in a moment. And concerning your question about the exchange between art and cartography, it's a really challenging one. So I think I will leave the floor to my colleagues and think a bit more about that. I'm sorry.
Okay. So, any of our presenters or Mike have want to pick up that hot potato?
If I may, about the memory politics, I'm very much interested in this aspect. With some Paduan colleagues, and in particular with a digital historian, we have submitted a grant proposal to the Italian Ministry of Research about COVID visual cultures, and we proposed a collaboration with Internet Archive to save pieces of the web for the future historian. So how are we building the memory, and how are we saving materially all this digital heritage of visualization and of course of covered mappings? And so maybe we could construct our memory policy in the future if we succeed, if we will succeed with the grant.
Yes, if I can add something, it's very interesting that in the archives of the Serenissima Republic of Venice, there is an entire collection dedicated to the maps related to the plague and also the containment policies about the plague. And so it's very interesting because it's a secret, something like a secret archive, and strictly related with the cartography of boundaries of the Republic of Venice. And so it's really we can say something like the heart of the state that the plague is challenging. Was challenging in the past, and so the Republic of Venice used all his instruments, his possibilities to represent the boundaries and the containment place of about the plague, like the Lazzaretti. Yes, I think that it's the same term in English. I don't know. Could you help me? Lazzaretto. Lazzaretto is a place where the affected in plague are contained, contained in the past.
Yeah.
And so it's very interesting that there is a lot of memory about the plague, the 17th plague.
I think the question might be whether like people basically want to move on. I mean, obviously people who've lost lost people, people who've themselves suffered, survived, but have long COVID, and several of my friends are in that situation. I mean, it's going to stay with them for the rest of their lives. But those who haven't suffered directly in that way, I suppose the issue is, well, will they just want to move on and forget? I mean, it's just a terrible time, and then of course there's a question of children and young people who've been growing up through this, and who in terms of the trauma, will have been affected, either sometimes directly, more or less more often indirectly, but it will leave a trace. And how are those memory traces, to be related to, and what role does participatory mapping, the kinds of mapping in which people, are able to, to put their feelings and put their stories and so on the map. I mean, certainly that's something that Livingmaps is very concerned about in this current Young Citizens Atlas project we're developing. So I'm sure that's part of a continuing conversation that we'll all need to be having, really. Kimball Bumstead, who I think was with us. I don't know, Kimball, are you still with us? Because Kimball actually curated a collection of maps which were for time on our website, and then with Sol Perez he wrote an article in Livingmaps Review 9. I mean, Kimball, I don't know if you have any thoughts on what you've heard this evening.
Put me on edge there. I don't know. It's been a fascinating presentation, all of them actually. No, I don't know. I think the last topic that you brought up, Phil, was kind of interesting about the kind of almost you're touching on the idea of the ethics of or the kind of functionality of making kind of creative or artist maps. And I think in a way there's something very sort of beautiful in a way about the process of just engaging with cartography from a very personal perspective, in a way. And I think it's it's really interesting when maps are sort of created not to actually represent something kind of in a sort of numerical or sort of literal way, but in a much more sort of abstract way that doesn't necessarily mean something, or the way that it's intended to be read is doesn't necessarily come across. Mike also touched on that in the beginning with something that he said about maps, which I can't remember how it was phrased, but something about maps which are yeah, kind of how a map tells the, I can't remember how Mike said it very, very beautifully, but sort of this distinction about sort of a map being something that really tells something, whereas a story being something which is more vague. Yeah, I'm not sure if I really have something kind of constructive to say, but just
sorry to put you on the spot.
That's right.
But I mean, in your own practice, I mean, you know, as in your own artist practice, I mean, you spend a lot of time thinking as well as doing various forms of kind of map making, and you also worked with various kinds of groups, communities, and so on. You know, when in a sense you share your practice with them, and they pick up on that, and or they modify it, or they bring their own sorts of ways of mapping into it. So, you know, I mean, what you actually do is actually creating a bridge between those two kinds of sets of practices, really. So that's why I brought you in there.
Yeah.
I mean, Mike, have you got any other last thoughts before we bring the proceedings to a close?
Yeah, I could say a little bit about the archiving and collective memory, and maybe we need to have a conversation about digital archiving and the kind of political economy of that. So, you know, there's always been a political economy of archiving and whose stories gets saved and whose don't. But nowadays there's an assumption that everything is somehow saved on the cloud somewhere, but there's a cost to that, and who is footing the bill. And, you know, if we look at university grants, for example, they're usually for, you know, 3 to 5 years maximum. After then, where do all the kind of stories from those kind of projects, where do they go? Who stores them? How long are they stored for? There's one I was thinking of called Corona Diaries. I'll just put the link into the chat. It's kind of an audio testimony about the pandemic, and I think they map those testimonies. And it's a brilliant project, but I do wonder, you know, is this project going to be around in 25 years if the money runs out? Whereas, you know, we know from analog media that if you did all these on tapes, so when if Toby Butler's here, those tapes would still work today if someone, you know, wants to store them in their loft. So there is an interesting dimension here around digital archiving and how it's on the one hand very freeing because you can record anything, but on the other hand quite restrictive in terms of how that is stored, who stores it, and for how long.
If I may jump in connected to this, I think that the many of the artists that I mentioned decided to print also this collection out in order to make these archives somehow tangible and materially stable. And so they were firstly circulated through the more easiest way, which is online, but then many of them decided to collect them and print them out. Especially because I think that in this case, we saw the archive becoming necessary because we had all the feelings that history was happening in that moment. I don't know, which is something that sometimes happens afterwards, but in that case, there was the feeling that something needed to be kept in mind and in memory, and something was happening that needed to be represented and collected somehow. So.
Yes, it's certainly is a yes. I think we need to perhaps to do some more thinking on this, the relationship between different kinds of mapping, particularly sort of community-based mapping, and the archive, the living archive, I like to put it. I mean, how, you know, what platforms need to be developed for that to happen. But one thing's for sure, the legacy, the long shadow of COVID. I mean, you know, the memory politics are going to be contested, and there's going to be, you know, quite a lot of pressure from, well, certainly from, I think, from governments to do this sort of official commemoration, and then to tacitly endorse a lot of forgetting of, some of the, in some cases, terrible blunders and short-sightedness and corruption, even that has been mobilized in the state responses to the pandemic. But that's, I think, another whole other I don't say can of worms really, but something. But certainly with Livingmaps, I think we're going to, obviously this is something we're going to stay with the trouble, as I think it was Donna Haraway said, wasn't it? I think so. Stay with the trouble. So that's what we're going to do. And thank you all for staying with us this evening. And of course, especially to our 4 presenters, who I think it's 9 o'clock Italian time. So you must all be starving and want to get off and have something nice to eat. So anyway, thank you so much, all of you, for some really, really rich and thought-provoking presentations. And thanks to Mike Duggan, who's amongst many other, is the editor-in-chief of our online journal, which goes from strength to strength. And before I finally finish, I just mention our next event in this series. It's being undertaken by an organization called Walking Lab, and by its director, Stephanie Springay, and they're putting on a whole kind of show for us really on June the 16th about radical relatedness. So I'm picking up maybe some of the themes that have come through from today as well. Maybe I should be a DJ in my next existence. Anyway, thanks all of you, our presenters and those who've joined us, and do stay tuned and check our journal out and check our next event. Okay, thank you all very much.
Grazie.
Good evening.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.
Thank you so much.
Bye all.
Grazie.
Ciao.